I'm Zach.
And I'm Gabe. We're two college students who have a hard time finding easy to understand, non-skewed, and easy to listen to explanations of complicated topics.
So, we decided to start a podcast to help explain them.
This week, we will discuss the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from an educational perspective. You are listening to the Explicationist Podcast.
This episode is strictly for educational purposes. We will do our best to keep it as unbiased as possible, and nobody's perfect. Unfortunately, we can't fit the entirety of this very touchy subject into one episode. With that all being said, we hope you enjoy. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion, a prominent Zionist leader who became the first Prime Minister of Israel, proclaimed the State of Israel just that, a state. On the very same day, U.S. President Harry S. Truman recognized the new country. Israel, a country about the size of New Jersey, is about to embark on a 73-year conflict for land, religion, identity, governance, and some would say, freedom. Israel, located in the Middle East, is home to 8.7 million Israelis. 74% are Jews, 17% are Muslims. About 2% are Christians, with the remainder being labeled other. Israel is a land of many people, most of whom just want to live everyday lives.
The area known as Palestine has been inhabited since at least the 15th century BC, and in the 16th century AD, it was incorporated into the Ottoman Empire. During World War I, Palestine fell to the British forces and became part of the British Mandate of Palestine. After the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, it was captured and turned over to the country of Jordan. In 1967, it was captured by the Israeli forces. Between 1993 and 1999, a series of agreements transferred control of this area from Israel to the newly created Palestinian Authority. In 2001, the negotiations to determine the permanent status of this site stalled, and the standing of Palestine has remained in limbo ever since. The United States does not officially recognize the country of Palestine. Still, international organizations, such as the United Nations and the Arab League, do acknowledge the sovereignty of the State of Palestine. Palestine, located in the Middle East, is home to almost 3 million people, and is slightly smaller than the U.S. state of Delaware. 80 to 85% of Palestine is Muslim, 12 to 14% are Jewish, and 1 to 3% are Christian.
You may have heard at some point that this is all about some old religious beef, and while that may be partially true, the main point of contention is primarily a land dispute between the two. The political context of the conflict started back in the 20th century, just after the end of World War II. Thousands of stateless European Jews fleeing persecution wanted to establish a homeland of their own. As a result, a movement called Zionism took root. Zionism is the idea of reestablishing and now developing a Jewish homeland or state. It then led to the creation of Israel, which leads to the British essentially ending their mandate over Palestine.
At midnight on May 14, 1948, the British mandate over Palestine had officially ended. British troops began leaving the Israeli city of Haifa. Palestinian citizens are now no longer protected by British law. Their passports are useless, and the Palestinian state police are disbanded.
The exodus had begun. Also known as the Nakba, over 700,000 Palestinian Arabs were forced out of their homes and off their land. Later on, some laws had been passed by the first Israeli government that stated that any Arab who had left was unable to reclaim their land, homes, and belongings. As a result, many descendants of these British Palestinians remain refugees. Some historians refer to this period as ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people.
To this day, the ability for Palestinian refugees to return to their homes is still up in the air, and a large part of why the conflict persists today.
The League of Nations had decided that there would be a two-state solution. Well, the Arab League wasn't a massive fan of this idea, so the following day after the mandate had ended, they marched their troops into the new Israel, beginning the Arab-Israeli War of 1948. Let's go into a brief timeline of the conflict. So we've discussed the beginning of this conflict. Now, let's get into what happens after. After the Arab-Israeli War, Israel signs armistice agreements with most of the major nations involved.
Between 1948 and 1966, several minor skirmishes between militant Islamist groups and the Israelis, along with the Israeli government taking infiltrators pretty seriously. Lots of blood is shed.
In June of 1967, the Six-Day War between Israel and the combined forces of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and their supporters ensues. Israel defeats all parties and captures the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, Jordan, and the Golan Heights. The number of dead ranges between 15,000 and 25,000. All of this in 6 days.
Between 1968 and 1973, several brutal terrorist attacks occurred on both sides, from a school bus bombing by the Palestinian militant groups to the Israeli Air Force shooting down a plane full of passengers and crew.
At the end of 1973, the Yom Kippur War begins. Syria and Egypt unleash a surprise attack on Israel in the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights, on the last day of Ramadan no less. Among other Arab nations, Iraq and Jordan joined in support of the war effort on behalf of the Arab cause. As a result, many Israelis were taken into custody and tortured as prisoners of war.
Between 1974 to the 1980s, the Palestinian insurgency in South Lebanon grows.
1978, the Camp David Accords were signed. Israel withdrew from the Sinai Peninsula in exchange for peace. In addition, they set a framework for future negotiations regarding the West Bank and the Gaza Strip.
From 1987 to 1991, we have the First Intifada. It begins with protests, strikes, and civil disobedience, and quickly turns into violence and terror campaigned by the Palestinians. After the First Intifada, Hamas is born. The Israeli army killed over 1,000 Palestinians, while 164 Israelis were killed.
After Hamas is formed, terrorism begins to heighten.
1991, the Gulf War begins. Saddam Hussein tries to bait Israel into war. They do not bite.
In 1993, the First Intifada ends. At this point, over 1,200 Palestinians and 160 Israelis are dead.
In 1994, Benjamin Goldstein opens fire on Palestinian Muslims worshipping at the Ibrahimi Mosque, injuring 125 and killing 29. He was beaten to death by the survivors of the attack.
A few months later, Hamas does a second suicide bombing in Afula, Israel, killing 6 people, including the bomber.
On May 18, 1994, Israeli forces move out of Gaza City in compliance with the Oslo Accords.
In the year 2000, the Second Intifada begins. More violence and no answers.
Between 2000 and the present day, many peace talks and agreements have been made, but violence on both sides is still high. Terrorist attacks on mosques and synagogues alike, public transport, the elderly, children, from rocks to missiles.
This has been a very brief timeline that shows the kind of destruction and violence shown by both sides over the years. So, how can this be solved?
While we may not have the answers, countless solutions that could help to ease tensions and calm relations have been thrown around by analysts and organizations alike. However, each one has unique benefits and downfalls. For many, the most viable solution is to do nothing. It takes the least time and political capital. However, this comes at the high price of casualties and strained relationships in the long run.
The most discussed real solution has become known as the two-state solution. The two-state solution would involve 2 sovereign countries, Israel and Palestine. In this solution, each state recognizes the sovereignty and bounds of the other state and allows the independent governance of the other. The downside to this is lots of land that the 2 countries would split is currently heavily disputed, and both argue what land belongs to who.
One section of land that would come into dispute is Jerusalem. Both Israel and Palestine claim it as their capital. Another solution that has been floated around is a 3-state solution that would create the sovereign states of both Israel and Palestine, but would also create Jerusalem as its own city-state with its own governing body.
There are also solutions such as a one-state solution that would merge Palestine and Israel and create one country. Of course, there are evident and very similar issues with this particular solution. Recent talks between the governing bodies often stall and end in hardships. Many groups have floated the ideas of unilateral solutions that each country should do to at least ease tensions. These include a commitment by Israel to stop expansion, reduce restrictions on Gaza, ending forms of collective punishments, dealing with the rampant terrorism from Palestine, and allowing for the reopening of certain Palestinian institutions throughout Israel.
There are ongoing talks between the two states and the future of their lands. Many countries have intervened and attempted to assist in negotiations. For example, the Foreign Minister of Canada plans to travel to Israel soon to help advance a two-state solution between the two.
So what's next? It's kind of hard to say what's next for these two. Tensions between the two areas have been high for almost a century. Without a solution soon, we're probably going to continue to see death and destruction. We can only hope that some solution, or at least a long-term ceasefire, can come into effect to help ease tensions. We're likely going to continue to see talks between the two until they reach such an agreement. Hopefully, with the entrance of new leadership in Israel, a solution will be more likely. Still, it's hard to say for sure if anything is going to change.
The conflicts between Israel and Palestine are long-going and complicated. We hope you could learn something and understand why the context is critical to understand before developing a solid opinion on any issue.
We, of course, encourage you to do your own research on the topic if you're interested, as we're definitely not experts on this. We have nowhere close to covered everything about this subject, but we hope that we helped you learn a little about the topic at hand. With that being said,
thank you for listening to the Explicationists podcast. You can follow us on Twitter to keep up to date at Explicationists.
And you can contact us at theexplicationistpod@gmail.com. This has been The Explicationists. Thank you for listening.